Okay, we'll take this from the top. Thanks everybody for joining the presentation. My name is Yeosh. I'm with Push Button Creative Audio. It's a creative audio production company based in Orlando, Florida. We develop a lot of podcasts. We develop audio branding for regional national advertisers, including custom music production, voiceovers, things of that nature. And today we're talking about the art of the branded podcast. So essentially creating content in a podcast format for brands large and small. One of the things that's really important to note, and sort of abbreviating what we talked about a little bit earlier, podcasts are essentially an extension of what's already happened in the digital age with blogs and YouTube, for example, right? So where the newspapers used to be one of the primary avenues for media, right? Essentially, we took that and we created blogs, and we took a platform that used to be semi-exclusive, right? So you used to have a degree and you used to have to go work at a newspaper, and you used to need to have access to these things in order to have your message spread widely. Now we gave people a platform through blogging that allowed them to create the content on their own and distribute their messages without needing access to all those things. Similarly with broadcast television, right? When YouTube came around, YouTube essentially created a platform for people to be able to get on there, create their own content, talk about things that mattered and were of interest to them. And that message is able to be proliferated without the need for broadcast antennas and towers and things of that nature. And so what we're seeing with podcasting is a lot of the same things. We knew that audio as a medium is a really great way to storytell, which is where a lot of brands live. So podcasting is a really simple and easy extension of that radio platform, which goes back over 100 years, and extending it straight into the digital age. It's honestly kind of remarkable it took this long for that to happen, in my opinion, especially when you consider that today's consumers are so comfortable in audio-first environments. We start to see audio brands really being developed well within the past 4 or 5 years. A lot of brands are getting into creating their own signature audio marks, right? So whether it's McDonald's and ba-da-ba-ba-ba, or a number of other brand executions like that. And even, the audio first formats that we see in our own homes with Alexa and Google Home, and the ways that we're interacting with audio devices and at home and in the workplace, people are increasingly more comfortable with this audio first format. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons why podcasting is taking eyeballs away from television, away from some of the digital TV screens. And we'll cover that a little bit later in the presentation. But before we get into that, I want to talk about 2020 being the year of podcasting. And, every year is the year of everything. And so earlier this year, back in January, when I was updating this presentation, I decided to ask Google what Google was predicting 2020 to be the year of. And I got some good responses. And now that we're kind of almost halfway through the year, we can check and see if Google is right. I can tell you this: Google did not predict this to be the year of the global pandemic. So that definitely didn't happen. Google is predicting 2020 would be the year of the rebrand, which, I guess could be true of any year, probably not necessarily specifically this one. 2020, Google is predicting would be the year of the consenticorn, which, 5 months into the year, if anybody can tell me what a consenticorn is, I'll send you a cookie. But for those of you who don't know, it's essentially a consenting hall. It's a hall monitor in social settings that makes sure that everyone is consenting. So if you're in the club, which if you're like me, you're always in the club. It's somebody who makes sure that people are consenting to being danced with, I guess. I don't know. But that's a good one. 2020 is the year of the Earth Pig, which is just a fact and gives me a reason to use this GIF. 2020, they are predicting 2020 would be the year of the layered pixie, which couldn't be further from the truth, because 2020 ended up being the year of no haircuts, which is why I'm wearing this hat. I would take a layered pixie, whatever that means at this point. But 2020 is definitely the year of podcasting, and I've got some data and some metrics to prove it. First of all, the average consumer is taking in about 52 minutes of audio per day on their mobile device. Now, this includes across apps, right? So this could be anything from listening to Pandora and Spotify to iHeartMedia. This could be podcasting. This could be any number of things. But on average, a consumer is listening to about 52 minutes of audio just on their mobile device. We've seen about a 300% increase in ad spend year over year. So this is where we're seeing that the advertising and marketers are recognizing that podcasting is a viable play for many of their clients. So the ad revenue generated, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes and a few other slides too, but the revenue is spiking for sure. And we've seen an over 1,500% increase in podcast listenership from 2013 to 2019. Now, the numbers for 2020 are still obviously in progress, and I expect that we're going to see some kind of a dramatic shift. I don't know in which direction yet in terms of podcasting. When you look at, I'll show you the numbers about where people are listening to podcasts pre-pandemic, and maybe you can draw some inferences there. So listenership ages of podcasts are doing very much what Facebook did 15 years ago. So 3-4 years ago, that 18 to 24 demographic is where the majority of the listenership was. As that group has aged out of college and into sort of like, young adult life, that shift has grown, right? So they've aged a little bit older. So that demographic has shifted to 25 to 34, similar to what Facebook did, right? I was in that college group around 18 years old when I got my first Facebook. And then, as we got a little bit older, and then all of a sudden you see a huge shift, and now everybody's grandma's on Facebook, right? So right now, the largest demographic increase for podcast listenership is 40 plus. So this 45 to 54, 55 to 64, like that's where we're seeing a lot of growth in the podcast industry currently. It's the fastest growing of the demographics. So if we look at podcast listenership by gender and by ad revenues, this is what it looks like. So by gender, you've got about a 50-50 split. So there's no clear-cut gender that's listening to podcast one over the other. But as we were talking about earlier, you can see podcast revenue has shot up dramatically in the last 5 years, more than doubled. And we expect that in 2020, that's going to increase significantly as well. And towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about how you can buy media on podcasts if that's something that's of interest to you. So where are people listening to podcasts? I think when I originally was researching this presentation about a year and a half ago, I was expecting that the majority of the listenership was going to be happening on the drive to work, to and from work, or maybe during a workout. But you can actually see that the majority of the listening is happening at home, more than half. And the interesting thing about this is podcasts are becoming a shared experience. So a shared experience between people who live in the same home, but it's also something that people can do without interrupting their visual field, right? So they are not tied down to a screen. So you can wash the dishes and listen to a podcast, take the laundry out and listen to a podcast or whatever. You can do other things. You can have a podcast on while you're playing a board game or while you're doing any number of other things. And so this is why I think that the trend of podcasts post-pandemic, post-lockdown is probably going to increase dramatically. I know that I myself have been consuming more, but I'm not a fair barometer because I produce podcasts for a living. So of course I listen to more. But we'll see as soon as the data comes out. I'm sure it will shortly. Currently, there are over 800,000 active podcasts in existence. And if you've ever gone onto Apple's podcast store or app and pulled podcasts randomly, like without a friend recommendation about a podcast to listen to, you know that the majority of these 800,000 are pure garbage. I mean, they're just not produced well. They're not well researched. It's people who think that they can just sort of turn on a microphone and that they're going to be inherently very interesting. And that's only true of a very few number of people. So what I would say is this is very akin to people who were starting YouTube channels 10 years ago, or people who had blogs 15 years ago, where it was just such overrun of information and overrun of just people putting garbage out. And I remember attending a webinar or a seminar, an AAS seminar, like 12 or 13 years ago, where the whole thing was about like blogging, and you have to blog, and oh my God, if you're not blogging, you're not getting new business and all this stuff. And it was about like, just put any content out there. And the reality is, of course, that that's not true. But in this environment, with over 800,000 active podcasts, it sounds like a big number. It's not a big number at all. 800,000 active podcasts, if you compare with the number of, for example, YouTube channels, which is in the tens of millions, like this is a very small number comparatively. So there's a lot of room for growth, particularly in the niche. If you're like a niche brand, and we'll cover specifically what brands it's good for, podcasting is good for. But if you're in like a niche brand space, this could make a lot of sense for you. More than half of the U.S. has listened to a podcast at this point already, and I suspect that this number has increased dramatically since the pandemic. And everybody who's listening to podcasts, you find that about 1 in 5 of them are listening each month since 2018. 1 in 5 Americans are listening each month. So what we see is, about a 20% penetration rate in people who are actually engaging and listening to podcasts. And again, this is 2018. I don't have more recent data than this. Unfortunately, this is not stuff that's researched very, very frequently. But if 1 in 5 Americans in 2018 are listening to podcasts, you can imagine it's only grown more since then. So we've seen about a 27% increase in podcast creation just in 2019. So people and brands are really starting to recognize the power of this. And I'm sure that of all the people on the call, if you guys are in a marketing department at a brand, I'm sure the conversation about starting a podcast has come up, because literally everybody I talk to who I mention, doing a podcast will inevitably say, oh yeah, we talked about that as well. Same with ad agencies. I mean, ad agencies love to be content creators as well. And it's a very similar thing. Podcast average listenership is about 6.5 hours a week. You're seeing about 6 subscriptions per person on average of people who are listening to podcasts. Now, the difference is here, it says 6 subscriptions, 7 episodes a week. So a subscription is very similar to like a YouTube subscription, right? So you go and you're listening to podcasts, you find one you like, you subscribe to it. And the benefit of that is when a new episode comes out, you get informed that there's a new episode available, so you can go ahead and listen. So it's the subscriptions versus downloads. When I talk about downloads, I'm talking about how many people listen to a particular episode. When I'm talking about subscriptions, I'm talking about how many people subscribe to a particular channel. So what is a brand podcast? As you can imagine, I'm sure I would normally ask, if this was a live presentation, I would normally ask who in the room has actually recorded a podcast or maybe been on one or listened to one. And I'm sure the majority of you have at least listened to a podcast, right? So a brand podcast is essentially taking a brand's perspective on a topic and creating show content for that is targeted directly to the consumer that they are, their target demographic, right? So does that mean that we're creating podcasts on behalf of a brand that are entirely self-serving? If you're doing it right, no, right? So why would you want to create a brand podcast though if you're a brand? Like, why invest time and money into something like this? Well, it's largely a PR and a social tool. So this is not the kind of a thing that you do to generate sales. This is more of a tool of goodwill. It's a tool of talking about some of your brand's missions and visions and engaging with your audience on a different level, right? So you're building that trust from the audience. That's what podcasts do well. That's why we typically will work, when we work on a podcast, we typically work with the PR team at an agency, or we work with the social team and the PR team in order to create sort of the right content and the right tone for the piece. This is not always something that we work with the advertising team or even the creative team on. But it helps with brand engagement. It increases brand awareness, of course, because you're putting your brand out there. You're elevating the brand at the same time because you're establishing yourself as an industry expert. Of course, if you are talking about your products or if your products are coming up through the context of the podcast, you're increasing consumer product knowledge, and you're ultimately trying to create trust with the consumer, right? You're trying to establish a loyal customer base. And of course, it makes your PR and social teams happy. So we do everything to keep them happy. Podcasts, though, do also require active listening. They're great tools for consumer research as a primary or even secondary research tool. Makes a lot of sense for sure. Successful branded podcasts that I want you guys to check out. So there's 3 that I think do a really good job of developing the right kinds of content that consumers want to engage with. So the first one I'm going to ask you guys to check out is one by General Electric called The Message. So General Electric, you know them because you probably have a dishwasher by GE. But GE is, the majority of what they make is stuff that you and I are never going to buy. It's jet engines, it's X-ray scanners, it's all sorts of stuff on a high level, right? So they got into wanting to create this podcast, but instead of doing what a lot of brands do, which is a knee-jerk reaction to create something that talks about their product, they totally went the opposite direction. They created a science fiction podcast, and they used that science fiction platform to tie in their products in essentially a search for extraterrestrial messages. So they found a way to take their products, something that was really interesting to the general consumer, and they married the two together. It's a really great execution, something that you might want to check out. Second one is one called The Sauce by McDonald's for Rick and Morty fans in attendance. You guys no doubt know about McDonald's Szechuan sauce. But those of you who weren't, the skinny is that essentially Rick and Morty, which is a popular cartoon series, created a whole uproar over the McDonald's Szechuan sauce, which had been discontinued for the last 20 years. McDonald's tried to capitalize it, kind of created a public relations disaster over it. And instead of living in that failure, they took the opportunity to create this podcast, which took a public relations problem and kind of created an opportunity out of it. It's kind of a brilliant twist. Of course, because they're McDonald's and they're master marketers. And the third is one called Lip Stories by Sephora. They essentially have created a podcast series that focuses on their target demographics, right? So it's the people who inspire the products that they create. They took and they held essentially a mirror up to their target demo, and they said, look, these are stories of people who inspire us, and we think they'll inspire you too. And ultimately what they're doing is showing their target that they understand them, they get who they are, and they get their experiences. And so this is another great one for you to check out if you've got some time to check them out. So what brands does a branded podcast even make sense for, right? So we talk about lifestyle brands. Lifestyle brands are prime. Like, this is an easy way for you to go, like that Sephora, like that is a lifestyle brand. That is an easy way for you to get into podcasting. You're blessed if that's kind of the position that you're in. So if we break it down into more specifics, right? So let's take the automotive category. In the automotive category, Toyota is not a lifestyle brand, right? Toyota's a value brand. It's utilitarian. But even within Toyota, right, you look at Toyota Racing Division, right, which is a line of performance trucks. So that is a lifestyle. That specific subset of the Toyota brand is a lifestyle brand. Even to a point, Scion, when Scion was a thing, I mean, it was millennial focused. But like, if you look at specifically that, or if you look at, for example, Subaru is a lifestyle brand, Jeep is a lifestyle brand, like those are brands within the automotive category that would make sense, right? Because they can create content that's for an audience that all have sort of a similar perspective or viewpoint or desire, or, they have similar interests. So it makes it a lot simpler. Brands with an educational mission are also ones that do very well in the podcast space. So I work specifically with a lot of financial institutions. So from their perspective, most of them have a financial mission, right? Because many of them are credit unions. So they're education-based, and they want to teach their membership about something related to whatever. The one thing that I will caution when your brand has an educational mission is it's very difficult to sugarcoat that content. And two things. One is the fact that if you've got an educational mission like financial services, there are already a million other brands out there that are producing that kind of content. So looking at your brand mission doesn't always answer the question, what should we talk about? If you have an educational mission, I would recommend that you keep them short, doing microcasts, 5 minutes. That way people have an opportunity to sort of digest it. You don't just drone on and on about a topic. Nobody has an interest in that. And B, I would look to make sure that there's nobody out there who's already doing it in the same voice that you're going to be doing it in. So if you're an educational, if you're in financial education and you look at Clark Howard and Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman and all these national, all these national talking heads who do the financial mission really well, if you agree with 95% of what they're saying, why compete with them? You know what I mean? Like, find a different way to talk about it in a new light. You know, if your brand is hyper local, if you represent an educational brand that's hyper local, tie it back to your local communities, because that's not something that, you know, one of these national brands is going to be able to do. So finding a way to bring it to the consumer with a new wrapping on it is going to do a lot for educational brands. Brands that take stands on a particular issue, whether it's social, political, environmental. So, you know, this is one of those things I talk about, like Reef, right? Or Costa del Mar, the sunglasses or whatever. Like, these are all brands that are very much tied into environmental missions as well. So it makes sense if they're going to have a consumer, a client base that's already attracted to the brand and lives that whole surf lifestyle or beach lifestyle. You know, tying it into that environmental, social, political mission that they are already a part of makes a lot of sense as well. And their demographic knows to expect that from them.
Hey,
right?
Yeosh, can I interrupt for 1 second? I'm so sorry.
Sure.
You have the hosting privileges, and there's a few people in the waiting room that I think only you are able to admit. Do you mind going into that participants and admitting?
Oh, is that why this thing keeps lighting up?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
This thing keeps lighting up.
Normally I would have that control, but I think I gave it to you.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you so much.
I'm admitting them. Wow, there's a lot of people waiting on here.
Please continue.
Sure. Thanks for those of you who are joining us. I apologize. I didn't know that I was supposed to let you guys in. We're just in the middle of a conversation about, I'm going to keep this up so that I can. We're talking about what brands podcasting makes sense for. So we were just talking about brands looking to connect with an audience on a more intimate level. Like, that is certainly an opportunity for you to create an engagement with an audience. However, making sure that you're creating the kinds of content that keep people engaged and also isn't repetitious of content that's already out there on the market, if that makes sense. So there's 5 basic things that you're going to need to create a great branded podcast. The first is the tech, which we'll cover a little bit of, the idea, the process, the platform, and the metrics. So this is the 5-step approach to developing a podcast. And I'm happy to share all of these slides with you guys later, so don't feel like you have to like take notes or anything. I'll share it with Deanne, and Deanne can share it with you guys, or I'll post it in the chat notes here at the end. So the first thing is the tech. It's a pretty simple setup. The tech basically includes a microphone, a preamp, a mixer, analog to digital conversion, some kind of a software platform to edit, and then as well as speakers. There are pre-packaged, oh, somebody's got a mic on. I'm just gonna mute everybody real quick. Okay, there are pre-packaged kits that will get you to some of this stuff. A lot of that tech is garbage. I mean, frankly, if you're going to be podcasting for yourself, if you're looking at creating something for yourself, consumer grade gear is fine. You know, you can probably get away with getting most of this stuff for under $1,000, probably between $500 and $1,000, and that's going to be okay. If you're podcasting on behalf of a brand, I would highly recommend you let a professional audio production company handle it, or B, you invest in at least pretty good professional grade equipment, and hopefully you have somebody who knows how to run it. Because if you're representing a brand, you really don't want to have, I mean, I don't think I have to explain this too much to a group of advertisers, but you really don't want to have, you know, low production quality at the end of the day when all this is said and done. So, you know, there's a lot of things. If you guys need advice on the types of equipment that you should purchase, you can definitely email me. I'll put my email address in the chat box. You can email me. I'll send you a list of a couple of different things that I would recommend. It's also going to depend on the room and the setup. And, you know, are you going to want to interview people over Skype? Are you going to have people in the room with you? There's a few questions. So this is the basic setup of what you need technology-wise. You can definitely email me if you have a specific question, and I will do my best to get you a list of the things that you can do or can pick up. The second is the idea, and this is where it always falls flat. This is where people don't know what to talk about, and especially for a brand, because it's a lot like putting the cart before the horse. I think a lot of times people come up with a great idea for a podcast, so they get into podcasts. Brands a lot of times say, I want to get into podcasts. Now, what's my idea? And that is a very difficult place to come from, because you really have to understand what your demographic is looking for before you can even start to formulate what possible show topics might look like or how a format might go. But I'm going to give you guys a few rundowns on some popular formats and some popular topics, and hopefully this will help you engage with your team members and help you guys figure out what it is that you want to talk about. A few of the different popular formats, these are 6 formats here that you see a lot on podcasts. The first being the monologue. Monologue, very difficult to pull off. Single show host, talking directly to audiences. Pretty much short of you being Barack Obama, I don't see how this is going to work. You got to have really great vocal quality, and you got to have something interesting to say, and you have to be able to carry a conversation. Rush Limbaugh is another guy who is an example of somebody who can literally turn a microphone on and talk for 3 hours and people will listen. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to sit in a room by yourself and talk and be entertaining. So I would say, for the most part, cross this one off your list. Monologue is not going to do it. A multi-host environment is sort of the minimum level, what I would recommend for a brand. So this is typically a 2 or 3 person host. You're developing a relationship with the hosts here, right? And the hosts have a relationship with each other. So in a lot of ways, people sort of envision themselves as a part of the team, right? The audience member considers themselves one of the people in the show. This is a lot like what morning radio is like, right? You've got 2 or 3 different people, they're interacting, they each have a role to play, and they each have their tropes or whatever. So this can be a lot of fun. If you've got a group of people who are talented and have a great relationship, then that comes across. That would definitely be a good option to consider. The next one would be interview style, right? So where you've got a primary host, maybe a secondary host, but you've always got a guest on the show, and that guest is providing a lot of the expertise related to a product or a service or whatever. And this is where brands often trip up as well. In interview style podcast format can be difficult because a lot of times, for example, if a CEO or a CMO or something like that wants to be the one to host, they're used to being the product channel expert. They're used to being the ones who are being invited to interview. When you're a host, your guests are your experts. And you need to do the job of getting that information from your guests. So if you end up inviting somebody on the show, but then you're just going to end up talking over them the whole time, what was the point of having that guest in there? So just keep that in mind when you're looking at interview content. Another format that you can look at is like a round table sort of conversational thing. This more feels like a panel discussion. The one thing I will say is, while this can be very entertaining, when it comes to podcasting, you may want to consider the fact that people are going to have a hard time telling voices apart. So if you've got too many people on, or if you've got people who sound too similar, it can be a little bit confusing for the audience, especially if the audience doesn't know who these people are, right? They're getting to know them and also becoming confused by what it is or who's saying what. But also it can be very well done if done correctly. The narrative, these last two, this is where advertising lives, right? The narrative and the storytelling. And this is where it gets, for me, the most interesting. That documentary style, the storytelling style, that This American Life type of podcast, the murder and the crime series, and the things like what GE did with The Message. Like, these are opportunities for you to get way, way deep into creating content. However, a word of caution, this is the most complicated and the most expensive type of podcast to produce. As you can imagine, it takes quite a bit of writing, quite a bit of pre-production, and quite a bit of knowledge to get stuff to work well, because storytelling in any vehicle is not easy, but it's double difficult in an environment where you don't have a visual. And not only are you setting, you're not just setting a tone and telling a story, but you're also having to paint some pretty vivid scene pictures. So it can become extra complicated. From a podcast topic perspective, these are the 5 most searched podcast topics that we see currently: society and culture, business, and that can be anything from like business self-help to, just general business podcasts. Comedy is a big one, news and politics, as well as health. So if you have a particularly your secondary missions, particularly your secondary missions, like range in one of these things, it's a great opportunity for you to take that avenue and delve deeper and figure out where your niche is within one of these. Now, there are a couple of different success factors to a podcast. Some podcasts want 1 million listeners, and that's cool, but that doesn't always mean that that's the only goal. There are, your goal may be to attract the right 5,000 listeners. And if that's the case, that's a different set of focus. That's a more niche focus. The purpose of this list is really to show you what people are searching for. So if you're looking to grow a broad audience, these are the search terms that the search categories that people are generally looking at. But if your goal is not to attract the most listeners, but the right listeners, then focus on what those listeners are trying to get out of it, right? Examining the brand's mission and vision, I've mentioned it a few times already. It's critically important because you don't want to be a brand, or even if you're just representing your personal brand, you don't want to be creating content that has nothing to do with something you stand for. People will be confused by that. Most brands have a pretty significant mission and vision, whether it's on paper or not is a different story, but they have a purpose. And you can create content that speaks directly to that purpose through a podcast. So make sure that whatever you pick is something that makes sense, that the target demographic is going to hear the content and go like, oh, I get why this brand did that. Because if you're not doing that, then don't even bother making content and just go advertise on other podcasts. Like there's no reason to create new content for things that don't speak to your brand's mission. Another thing to consider when you're trying to figure out your topic is what type of special access you have available. And I think a lot of people gloss over this one, but this is critically important. If you are talking about a topic, you need to say something interesting. You need to say it in a way that other people are not already saying it. But you also need to consider that by virtue of what you do, you may have special access that your demographic would be interested in that they don't already have. And that could be people that are, celebrities in the space, or it could be access to events or an environment that people don't readily have access to, right? So this kinds of special access are going to be critical to giving the end user or the listener an idea of why they're listening to this podcast, right? Because this is something they can't get anywhere else, or at least something that's difficult to come across. And finally, you have to consider, what do you want from your listeners? Because at the end of the day, you're creating content. You want something from your listeners. Your listeners know you want something, or you want something from them. So make sure you identify what it is you want. And it may not be for them to buy your product, right? It may be just, we want to work on our consumer sentiment. We want, consumers to be more aware of, ecologic, social responsibilities. Whatever it is that you want from your listeners should be one of the things that guides how you pick a topic and figure out the format. So here's a few tips on things that successful branded podcasts do. They firstly root themselves in the brand's mission, which we've talked about. They do offer unique perspective, a unique voice, something different than what's already out there. And like we talked about earlier, it's taking those things that make your brand unique. So if you've got a large audience on a national stage that is listening to a national podcast on a similar topic, then maybe you need to focus on the regional or the local aspect and how it is that, you interact with a more focused geographic area, how that makes it different, right? If you're talking about conservation, right? And there's a lot of great conservation podcasts that exist out there nationally. Maybe you take your conservation efforts hyper local and you talk about what's happening in the community or what's happening within a drivable distance of you, right? That's one way that you can create a different perspective. You can fulfill a desire, make sure that you do fulfill a desire of the target audience, right? So we're looking at our target and we're saying, what do you want already, right? Just because I make, fishing lures, right? Just because my company, that's all we do, doesn't mean that we have to do a podcast about fishing lures. If there's some bit of information that I learn, and this is where it's helpful to engage with social and PR teams, they may have a bit of information that says, 95% of our audience also does this, also engages in this other thing. That's, if you can find that tie-in to your brand, that's a great way to look into some different content, right? Because that, an entire podcast on fishing lures might be super interesting. I have no idea. But there is crossover in your target demographic when you've got a really niche product like that, right? The odds are those people are also engaging in other things that are very similar. And making sure that, or successful branded podcasts do also provide insight and access that the consumer couldn't otherwise easily get, right? Because otherwise, why are they listening? Successful branded podcasts do not directly sell products. That is our true recommendation. Do not get into selling products. Nobody wants to listen to product reviews from the people who made the product. If I want those product reviews, I'll just go to Google and figure it out through there. You don't assume the audience is dumb, because this audience, by and large, is probably going to be pretty well versed in what you're talking about, or at least have a pretty decent idea. But one thing you can do if you want to start a new podcast, starting at a baseline level, but growing in intelligence, not always starting every podcast at the 101 level, because people are going to grow with you. And, especially if it's a podcast that builds on itself, people can go back and listen to the earlier episodes. People are listening to things that they have an interest in and that they're learning more about. So making sure that you understand the audience can stick with you if you get a little bit, above what the average person knows. You cannot have a boring host. People absolutely tune in. It's a cult of personality. They fall in love with a show host. That's what they listen for. And the content is almost secondary, almost. So the question I get asked a lot in Q&A is, what do I do if I have a head of marketing or a CEO who wants to host a podcast, but I don't think they're going to do well? Well, I say good luck to you, because I don't know how to answer that question. If they're the ones signing the checks, it's kind of difficult to tell them that they can't. However, I will say this: people who are great on camera are not always great on radio or on a microphone. It's a very different skill set. People who come across as charming and endearing in person may sound creepy when there's no visual cue, right? There's no visual support for what this person is saying or whatever. And it can come across weird, right? That's thing A. Thing B, not everybody is built to be a show host. The show hosting is a difficult task. And particularly when you look at interviewing, the art of interviewing, there's a reason why people love watching Oprah. And that's because she can interview and she knows how to tell a story through interview that is very difficult to do. It's a hard skill set to learn. It is a learned skill set for sure. Hosting, a little less, because hosting is more about personality, right? It's about making sure you're engaging, making sure you have high energy. Interviewing, you can teach for the most part. Everything is sort of learnable, but there are aspects to hosting that need to sort of come from the inside. Successful branded podcasts can take a stand on social and political issues. We talked about that a little bit. You can get in the weeds because your audience might be a little smarter. They're searching for things. You can definitely take chances because at the end of the day, if something doesn't work, you just take it down, or you repackage it, or you relaunch it, or there's things that you can do. So we encourage you to take chances. Try show segments that may or may not be super interesting. You can always record it, listen back to it, and say, I don't want to hear this. So take some chances for sure, and let your audience tell you what they like and what they didn't like. Successful branded podcasts cannot be inconsistent with tone, messaging, or delivery of content. So what this means is essentially be consistent in the way that you're delivering your content to your listeners, right? So making sure that if you're following up on content that you talked about in earlier episodes, if you said that was something you were going to do, right? Making sure that you are delivering that podcast when you promise it. And this is a big deal. A lot of podcasts fall apart because people get caught into this, I'm going to deliver a podcast every week, and I'm going to deliver a podcast every week. And it's a lot like blogging. It's exciting at first, and then after a while, people get tired and they don't necessarily want to do it every week. So what we would typically recommend doing is creating content on a schedule ahead of time. Most brands are going to be able to do things that are evergreen, right? Most brands are not doing things based on the current news cycle. So you can create content in a limited window of time. It's usually how we do our branded podcasts. We take, 60 to 90 days and we create a production schedule that has us creating all of that content up front, buttoning it up, turning it over, and then see you next year, right? And then you can roll that out sort of on a more promised delivery day, right? Because it's all done. However, another thing that you can do with your audience is promise things in seasons. You can say, we're going to be recording season 1. We're going to do 10 episodes. We're going to do 15 episodes. And that gives you a great opportunity to revamp the show after a season, which is what I think is wonderful, right? You put 15 episodes together, you put them out, you can drop them Netflix style all at once. You can do one episode a month, one episode a week, or you can, essentially roll it out however you want, but make sure that you're telling your audience like, hey, this is just a season. And in this season, we're going to cover these topics or whatever. And at the end of the season, we're going to work on season 2, right? But that season 2 could come out in 6 months or a year. You're not making any promises, right? Because once that new episode hits, they're going to get noticed, right? And hopefully they're following your social media channels. You'll be able to also, relay information as to new season, but it gives you the opportunity to look back at a season and say what worked and what didn't work. What do we like? What is the audience like? You can poll your audience. You can do some focus grouping, and it gives you an opportunity to create a change for season 2. And that's something that if you've got a weekly podcast, you're almost reticent to ever just randomly change the format. But doing it seasonally will allow you to do that a little bit easier. Successful branded podcasts cannot be unoriginal. They can't deliver the same content as others because you'll just not ever get an audience. Why would people stop listening to another show to listen to yours if it's the same general content as what they're getting? And you definitely cannot have low production quality. I mean, that one I think goes without saying. You want to sound good and professional. There's a lot of text about to come up at you here in terms of the process. Again, I'm going to share these slides, so definitely don't feel like you need to write all this down. But here we go. This is the 5-phase process for putting a podcast together. Your first thing is going to be your preseason production. This is what many of you are likely in now, right? You've got an idea for a podcast. You don't know what to do with it, right? You're in phase 1. You're researching. You're thinking about themes. You're talking about segments. You're looking at, maybe you got a cool show name, but you don't know what exactly it's going to look like. Casting, you got to think about who's going to be hosting, who's going to be announcing, who are we interviewing, talking about the macro level of what's happening on this show. This is a great opportunity in this phase to record a test podcast, to play with formats. Right now, my company is producing 3 different podcast shows, and we're in the process of this right now where we're kind of just throwing stuff together in different samples and saying, okay, what works, what's not working, what exactly do we want to do in terms of format. Phase 2 of this process is going to be pre-episode production. And this is where it really is helpful to have somebody focusing specifically on the producing of the show. If let's say you've got a 10 episode season that you're working on, this is the phase where you're going to go in and specifically break out what are the topics we're talking about, who specifically are we interviewing, what's the information we're trying to get out of them. You got to do your pre-show interviews with all your guests. Making sure that you're assembling all of the package information so that your host feels knowledgeable about whatever they're talking about, and making sure that you're licensing the appropriate things that you need to license to make sure that you're not, doing stuff you shouldn't be doing with information or with media that you shouldn't be doing it with, right? So this phase is probably the most, the phase with the most work involved, because it's just a lot of research and it's a lot of time spent putting together your show packages so that you can get into phase 3, which is your recording phase, right? And this is where everybody wants to come hang out because it's the fun stuff. It's the traveling on site to record, or being in a studio, or going out and getting B-roll, or doing all this fun, what everybody thinks of when they think of production is doing all this fun stuff, right? They don't ever look at phase 1 and 2, which is all the hard work. But it's coordinating the show hosts, it's producing the show live, it's, all of the fun stuff, right? So you're going to find a recording studio, you're going to get the gear and record on site. And at the end of all this, you're going to probably record way too much audio. And then you're going to get into phase 4 and you're going to be like, oh my God, why did I record so much audio? right? So you got a 30-minute show and you got 2 hours worth of content. And now it's everybody disappears again because nobody wants to sit through an edit. And it's the reviewing of everything that you recorded and building the story. This is where it's good to bring that producer back in and have that person who in phase 2 put together the show content come back in and help you piece together the story to make sure that whatever it is sounds like they intended it. So, recording any pickups, getting it all put together, and then finally placements through some of the different podcast platforms, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a sec. And finally, phase 5 is the post-show launch. This is where you're posting new episodes at regular intervals, right? And there's services out there that are like a Hootsuite for podcasting. So if you've got 10 episodes, you can just line them up to roll out at specific dates, and they'll do so on their own. It's making sure that you've got your social media posts put together. It's making sure you've got your blog content and your show content mirroring each other, right? And pushing content to each other. That's another good key thing to do. It's making sure that the stuff that you filmed and recorded, right, while you were recording your podcast, hopefully you captured a lot of video of all that stuff happening, and hopefully you took some pictures. And that's the kind of stuff that you're going to be sharing now on social media to promote the show. A good split is to take, if you're going to be doing social media promotion for a show, is to take the 2 days ahead of a new episode and pre-promote the episode, and the 2 days after an episode and post-promote elements of the show to make sure that you're engaging with your audience in that way. So this is phase 5, which leads you right back into phase 1 when you start pre-production for season 2. The podcast platforms and promotions that you need to consider. Apple's podcast app is still going to be the king. They still have, the majority of the searchers. But what we're seeing now is a proliferation of podcast platforms, and I'm sure you've heard it. iHeartMedia has one, Pandora has one, Spotify has one. There's a lot of platforms, and Stitcher and SoundCloud are obviously still out there. These platforms, you don't have to be exclusive to one. So you can proliferate, you can put your podcast everywhere if you want. It takes more time. One thing that you should know is that particularly with Apple's podcast platform, it does take a week to 2 weeks to get your first episode up there because they have to vet your stuff. So don't expect that you're going to be able to upload right away. There's a process to getting the RSS feed set up. It takes a week or 2 weeks to get all that going. The money and the metrics, and this is specifically if there's any media buyers in there, this might be really interesting to you. We'll talk about how to place, but real quick, before we get into that, setting up a promotional plan is really critical to the success of the show. So if you just think you're going to just like anything else, you're not going to put a podcast out there into the universe, throw it up on a platform and expect 1 million listeners. You have to have a promotional plan attached to it. So creating a PR plan ahead of the show is going to be one of those critical success factors. Creating a PR plan along with your social team is going to be doubly successful, hopefully. So definitely making sure that you're interacting with that PR and social team ahead of creating the content, because they're the ones who are going to be able to help guide you into what kinds of content your audience is looking for, because that's the world they live in. Promoting through your social media channels is also going to be critical. Making sure that you've got guests on the show who attract that same target demographic that you're interested in going after, and making sure that they're aware when their episodes are going live so that they can promote the episode through their channels as well is going to be a way to grow your audience. Purchasing ads on other podcasts that have similar but not identical missions is a great way. So maybe dedicating a little bit of funding in order to promote, a sponsored ad on Facebook, as well as maybe buying some space on different podcasts that might have some crossover audience. Making sure you're filming some of the recording process and creating engaging social media content. Make sure you set up that RSS feed so that you can push episodes directly to people's devices, because that's the only way. They're not going to remember to go back and listen to a new episode. If they find something they like, they subscribe to you, they're going to get it pushed directly to their phone. It's the best way to do it. And finally, making sure that you are doing what we talked about earlier, which is the pushing the blog content readers into listening to more about a specific topic. And also when you're talking about a topic, making sure you're pushing people over to your blog. It's just a natural, easy way for you to cross promote stuff. Tracking your listeners. We talked about downloads versus subscribers, but again, downloads is the number of people who listen to a particular episode. Subscribers is the number of people on your channel. Very similar to YouTube. Subscribers being people who get informed if there's new content. Determine what success means for your brand. And this is, again, do I want 1 million listeners or do I want the right 5,000 listeners? And it's going to be different for every brand. So making sure you figure out what success means for you. Creating evergreen content is going to help your overall listenership base. So if you're looking to grow a large listenership base, making sure you create that content so that if somebody discovers you in the middle of season 3, they can go back to season 1 and listen to everything from the beginning, because that's ultimately only going to help your overall listenership numbers. If you have content that's not evergreen, we certainly are going to recommend that stuff's going to have to be pulled at a certain point in time. And even if you do have content that's evergreen, you're going to want to go back and check your content every couple of years or whatever, just to make sure, or every year at some point, just to make sure there's nothing in there that is suddenly very, very not okay, The ads that you sell on podcasts, so you can sell ad space. There are smaller platforms. One is called AdvertiseCast. This is one where you sign up for yourself. So if you've got a personal podcast or if you have a brand podcast, so I'm not sure this is the right space for brand podcast, you go in there and you basically list out what your podcast is about. Advertisers can go in and say, hey, I'm going to pay you $10 to run an ad for my product. You can choose to accept it or not accept it, and that's great. The challenge with podcasts right now, because it's a little bit of the Wild West, there's no rate card for podcasts. You might get some who are strictly on like a CPM method of pricing, and that's fine, I guess. But what more likely ends up happening, particularly if you call a local podcast, they're either going to be like, I want $1 million, or they're going to be like, I'll do this for like a bologna sandwich, because they don't know how to price it themselves. And in many cases, these are people like, who really don't do this for a living. So they're not really exactly sure what to say. And if you are a brand who's considering advertising on a local podcast, this might make sense for you. However, I will caution that podcasts they don't have the same standards and practices as a lot of the broadcast stations will have. They're not beholden to an FCC license. So just make sure that if your brand is going to advertise on a podcast, you listen to the podcast, make sure that the content is the right kind of content, make sure that the hosts are right ambassadors for the brand, and ultimately have a conversation with that host or those hosts and make sure that they are creating an environment that is safe for your brand. And if not, maybe consider not spending money there. If you've got a bigger podcast, once you get to a certain point, you get invited into certain platforms like Midroll. Midroll is a podcast platform that represents, some of these major brands like Conan O'Brien or Dr. Phil. And these are for if you're going to be doing like regional or national buys. So if you represent a brand that's thinking about buying on a podcast, Midroll is a great opportunity for you to go check out and be able to buy some regional national ads. These are the basic ad types that you can expect to find: pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll, live read, and recorded reads. These are pretty standard ad units. I think most of you probably know what these are. The gold standard is going to be the live read, because just like morning radio, the gold standard is tied to the show host, right? So if a show host is essentially doing a live product endorsement, that's going to carry a lot of weight with the audience, because like we said earlier, that show host, it's a cult of personality. People listen a little for the content, they listen a lot for the people who are on the show. So that live read is going to be the most expensive, followed by a recorded read. And then some of these the pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-rolls are probably going to be, standard pre-recorded ads by a production company like mine. Some final quick tips that I want to leave you with. First is to put together a dynamic team on air. Don't rely on a single person. You can break this up a number of ways. You can do segment hosts. You can do, like certain people will do interviews. You can have different people rotate in and out of the host chair, though that's a little dicey because then you never really build trust with the audience. But if you look at This American Life, they do a really good job of it, where Ira Glass is always sort of the studio host, and then he'll kick it to somebody else who's telling the story this week. But he's like the guy, right? And he is sort of seen as the one in charge of all of these other people who are interviewing on his behalf. So creating that dynamic team is really critical to the success of a show. Secondly, you want to create segments that involve your listeners. And this is an easy thing for you to do to increase listenership. And that could be, shout outs to people on social media, from social media who are fans of the show. You can invite certain fans or people or listeners to come in and be a part of the show. You can have game show segments where people are calling in. You can take just regular call-in questions. Things like that. Just find a way to incorporate your listeners into the show. It's going to make them feel more a part of the process, more engaged, more invested, and help them help you promote the show. You're going to want to look for guests who already have a following with your target demographic. This is a no-brainer. It's just very easy for you to do. Consider that when you're looking for who to interview. You're going to want to invest in production quality. Obviously, I own a production company. Of course, I'm going to say this. But if you're representing a brand, even if that brand is you, invest in good production quality. Get decent equipment. Don't just open your MacBook and expect to turn it on. Those of you who've listened to podcasts know it's a very personal relationship. People are living in your ears, right? Because you're mostly listening to them through earbuds. And if the production quality is garbage, they're gonna shut it off fast. They're never even gonna get to the content because they're just gonna turn it off and go find something that's got better production quality that is not painful to listen to. And finally, you're gonna wanna be consistent. Create that content ahead of schedule, have a schedule in place, sit down with your team and say, we're gonna focus the next 30, 60, 90 days, we're gonna create this stuff, and then we're not gonna touch it for 8 months, right? That's gonna be the way to do it, because creating that content week after week is eventually gonna lead to some kind of a breakdown in the process. And for those of you who have done white papers before or done blogging before or anything like this, you know it's true. And so, to warn the others. So that's all I got. Thank you guys for listening, and thanks for putting up with that craziness that happened. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time, but I will take questions, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Yeosh. Just wanted to say sorry again to everybody for the. Hi, everybody. Sorry.
No.
Thank you so much, Yeosh. I appreciate everything you've presented today. Any questions from anybody right now? Looking in on the chat room here, or the chat here. Nothing so far. Just wanted to.
We have a Rick and Morty fan.
I see that. I want to take a minute to apologize to everybody for the trouble this morning with the original one. That certainly does not represent our club. Just a blanket statement there.
I'm sure people know that doesn't represent their club. I'm going to hang on, before we disconnect, I'm making a quick PDF document here of the slides, and I'm going to drop it here into the chat window as soon as it's done. And then I'm going to also type in, this is my email address here in the chat. It's yosh@pushbuttonproductions.com. I assume anybody who watches later is going to be able to access that. And I'm going to drop in this file. Oh, it's not. Hang on one second.
Yeah, very much appreciated. I'll also be posting a recording of this on our website later today. And I'll get a hold of these slides and post those as well.
Awesome. I know it's supposed to let you upload. This is not letting me upload, though. I wonder if this is a different.
Yeah, if you're trouble, you can just email it to me and I'll send it directly to everybody.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I might have to do that. It's just not letting me do it.
Okay.
But in the meantime, if you guys need it sooner than that, you can email me at the email address there. Deanna, I will send this to you right now. If there's any questions, I'll take them. If not, I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you once again. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. See you later.